The lecture hall fell dead silent as Professor Mitchell held up the photograph, a grainy image of an F-16 Fighting Falcon banking hard through desert sky, missiles streaking past its wing. "This pilot," he said, his voice cutting through the hushed classroom, "executed one of the most daring combat maneuvers in recent military history, saving an entire ground convoy from certain destruction." His eyes swept across the rows of college students, landing on a quiet young woman in the third row who had suddenly gone pale. What most people don't know is that this hero is sitting right here in this room. 23-year-old Jessica Chen felt her heart stop as every head in the classroom slowly turned toward her, her carefully guarded secret about to shatter the ordinary college life she'd worked so hard to build. Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of her desk, her knuckles white against the wood grain. Professor Mitchell's military history class had always been her favorite, a chance to process her own experiences through academic distance. But now, staring at that photograph projected on the screen, she was transported back to that scorching afternoon over Afghanistan. The memory hit her like a physical blow, the radio crackling with desperate voices, ground forces pinned down by enemy fire, fuel running critically low, and the split-second decision that would haunt and define her forever. She remembered the weight of the stick in her hands, the G-forces pressing against her chest as she dove through a hail of surface-to-air missiles, the explosion that rocked her aircraft as she delivered her payload with surgical precision. What the photograph couldn't capture was the sick feeling in her stomach as she pulled up, knowing she'd just taken lives to save lives, or the sleepless nights that followed. "Miss Chen," Professor Mitchell's voice cut through her. Reverie, gentle but insistent. The classroom had erupted in whispers, phones appearing as students began recording, the atmosphere electric with disbelief and excitement. Sarah wanted to disappear, to deny everything, to maintain the carefully constructed facade of just another political science major working toward law school. But the professor's knowing eyes held hers, and she realized he'd planned this moment, perhaps recognizing something in her demeanor during discussions about military strategy, the way she spoke with too much authority about combat psychology, or how she tensed whenever aircraft flew overhead. Her throat felt like sandpaper as she finally nodded, barely perceptible, confirming what everyone now suspected. The girl who sat quietly in the back row, who never spoke unless called upon, who dressed in oversized hoodies and kept her hair long to hide the subtle tan lines from her helmet. She was Captain Jessica Chen, United States Air Force, with over 200 combat hours and 3 confirmed kills. The aftermath was immediate and overwhelming. Students who had never noticed her before suddenly surrounded her desk, their voices a cacophony of questions and praise that made her skin crawl. "Did you really fly fighter jets? How many missions did you fly? What's it like to kill someone?" That last question, shouted by a freshman with wide, curious eyes, cut through her like shrapnel. Sarah pushed past them, her breathing shallow and rapid, muscle memory from panic attacks kicking in as she fled the classroom. Professor Mitchell called after her, but she was already gone, racing down the hallway past stunned faces and pointing fingers. By the time she reached her dorm room, her phone was buzzing incessantly. Texts from classmates she'd barely spoken to, friend requests on social media, and missed calls from numbers she didn't recognize. The university's news blog had already published a story. "Hero among us, student revealed as decorated combat pilot." Her roommate Jessica stared at her with a mixture of awe and confusion, holding up her laptop screen. "Sarah, is this real? You're famous." But fame was the last thing Sarah had wanted when she'd traded her flight suit for textbooks, seeking anonymity and a chance to heal from wounds that couldn't be seen. The decision to leave active duty hadn't been easy, but Sarah knew she needed time to process everything she'd experienced. At 19, she'd been one of the youngest pilots ever to complete F-16 training, driven by a childhood dream of flight and a fierce patriotic calling after 9/11. Her parents, both immigrants who'd built successful careers in engineering, had been initially terrified, but ultimately proud when their daughter earned her wings. The first few missions had been routine, patrol flights, training exercises, the mundane reality of military service that civilians never saw. But then came the deployment to Afghanistan, where the abstract concept of war became brutally concrete. She'd flown cover for ground troops, provided close air support for special operations, and engaged enemy aircraft in heart-stopping dogfights that lasted mere minutes but felt like hours. Each mission carved something away from her, replacing youthful idealism with a hard-earned understanding of sacrifice and loss. The nightmares started after her squadron lost Lieutenant Rodriguez, shot down during a mission she was supposed to fly until a last-minute equipment malfunction grounded her aircraft. When her commanding officer suggested she consider the Air Force Academy for officer training, Sarah initially resisted. She was tired of the weight of responsibility, exhausted by the constant hypervigilance that combat demanded, and struggling with survivor's guilt that therapy couldn't quite touch. Her psychologist, a former pilot himself, suggested that education might provide the perspective and healing she needed. "You've served your country with honor," he'd said during one of their sessions. "Now serve yourself." The transition to civilian life was jarring, trading the structured hierarchy of military life for the chaotic freedom of college, where her biggest concerns were supposed to be exams and social events rather than life-and-death decisions. She'd chosen a small liberal arts college deliberately, somewhere she could blend in, where her past wouldn't define her present. For 2 years, she'd successfully maintained her cover, telling curious classmates that she'd taken time off after high school to figure things out, which wasn't entirely untrue. She'd made a few friends, joined study groups, and almost convinced herself that she could be normal. Now, sitting in her dorm room as notifications continued to flood her phone, Sarah realized that her secret identity was completely blown. But something unexpected was happening alongside the anxiety and frustration. Students were reaching out not just with curiosity, but with respect and genuine gratitude. A sophomore whose brother was deployed in Iraq thanked her for her service through tears. A veteran student she'd never known existed on campus knocked on her door, introducing himself as a former Marine who'd been struggling with his own transition to civilian life. "I thought I was the only one here," he said quietly, and for the first time since the revelation, Sarah smiled. Professor Mitchell appeared at her door the next morning with coffee and an apology, explaining that he'd recognized her from a military publication and felt her story needed to be told. "Your service honored us all," he said, "but your choice to continue growing, to seek education and new ways to serve, that's equally heroic." As word spread beyond campus, Sarah received calls from veterans organizations, requests for interviews, and invitations to speak at military events. Initially overwhelming, she began to see opportunity in the chaos, a chance to bridge the gap between military and civilian communities, to help other veterans navigate the challenging transition she'd fought through alone, and to transform her hidden past into a platform for positive change and healing. Sarah Chen's story reminds us that heroes walk among us every day, often invisible, carrying the weight of their service quietly and with dignity. Her journey from the cockpit of an F-16 to the lecture halls of higher education demonstrates that true strength lies not just in combat prowess, but in the courage to continue growing, learning, and serving in new ways. The young woman who once protected ground troops from enemy fire now mentors fellow veterans struggling with their own transitions, proving that service takes many forms and that the warrior spirit can find new battlefields in classrooms, communities, and the complex terrain of healing and hope. Her story also illustrates the profound disconnect between military and civilian communities, how a decorated combat pilot could sit unrecognized in a college classroom for 2 years, and how that revelation could shock and inspire an entire campus. In a time when many Americans have no direct connection to military service, Sarah's experience bridges that gap, helping civilians understand the sacrifice and complexity of military life while showing veterans that their skills and experiences have value beyond the battlefield. If Sarah's story has moved you, please take a moment to honor the veterans in your own community. They may be your classmates, co-workers, or neighbors, carrying invisible burdens and possessing incredible strength. Their stories deserve to be heard, their service deserves recognition, and their transitions deserve our support. Subscribe to hear more stories of hidden heroes, ordinary people who've done extraordinary things, and the continuing journey of those who've served our nation with courage and dedication. Because sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones sitting right next to us, quietly changing the world one day at a time.